The night before my daughter's engagement party, I sat alone in my car outside a stranger's condominium, holding a legal pad covered in notes I'd been too afraid to type anywhere Claire might find them. My name is Roz Larkin, and for 4 months, I had been driving my daughter's fiancé to work twice a week without him ever realizing who I was. He talked, I listened, and what I heard, ride after ride, convinced me that the wedding my daughter was so carefully planning wasn't the future she believed it was. 2 hours before I sat in that parking lot, I had found something in the back seat of my own car that I was never supposed to see. A folder with my daughter's entire future written inside it, and not one decision in it had her name attached. By the time the engagement party started the next evening, I would either destroy my relationship with my daughter by telling her the truth, or destroy something far worse by staying silent. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here's what you need to know going in. My daughter Claire was 29, sharp, independent, and, up until 5 months before that party, engaged to a man named Grant Calder, a 34-year-old wealth advisor from a good firm outside Nashville, Tennessee, with a good smile and better manners than most men his age. Grant had met me exactly once, at a crowded, dim restaurant a year earlier, for about 11 minutes, and he had not looked at me twice since. He had no idea that the woman who picked him up twice a week in a company car, wearing a black cap and prescription sunglasses, was the same woman he'd shaken hands with that night. 3 questions sat at the center of everything that followed. What was Grant planning that he hadn't told Claire? What was actually inside that folder I found in my back seat? And why did a story my Aunt June told me 30 years ago about a man who once did something almost identical to her keep surfacing in my mind every single time Grant opened his mouth? I need to back up further than the folder, further than the driving job, all the way back to who I was before any of this started, because none of it makes sense without that context. I spent 31 years as an emergency room nurse at a hospital outside Franklin, Tennessee. Long shifts, holidays worked more often than not, the kind of job that teaches you to read a room in about 4 seconds, who's lying about how they got hurt, who's scared and covering it with anger, who's telling the truth and doesn't know how to say it plainly. I retired 18 months before any of this began, mostly because my hip finally gave out, and a surgeon I trusted told me it was time. Recovery took the better part of a year. Somewhere in that year, I lost 40 pounds I hadn't been trying to lose, let my hair grow out its natural silver instead of the chestnut brown I'd dyed it for 2 decades, and had cataract surgery that left me wearing large prescription sunglasses outdoors more often than not. My husband, Harold, likes to joke that I came out of that recovery looking like an entirely different woman, and the truth is, for the purposes of this story, I did. Retirement did not suit me the way I expected it to. After 6 months of reorganizing closets and reading Harold the same 3 paragraphs of every mystery novel I picked up, I needed a reason to leave the house that didn't involve grocery shopping. A friend from church mentioned that a private car service outside Franklin was hiring retirees for part-time driving, corporate clients mostly, executives who wanted the same reliable driver more mornings than not. I applied on a whim. I did not need the money, I needed somewhere to be. Claire, my only daughter, was 29 and worked as a school counselor at a middle school in Brentwood. She was the kind of kid who noticed when other kids were struggling before their own parents did, and she carried that same instinct into adulthood, noticing everyone's pain but her own, more often than I liked. She'd had one serious relationship in her 20s that ended badly, with a man who criticized her constantly and called it honesty, and she came out of it more cautious, more independent, more determined, never to let anyone make her feel small again, which was exactly why, when she started dating Grant Calder, I let myself relax. Grant was polite. Grant was successful. Grant, on the surface, treated her well. I should tell you about my Aunt June here, because she matters more than you'll realize for a long while. June was my father's younger sister, married for 6 years in the early 90s to a man named Roger, who everyone in the family described, at the time, as driven. Roger made decisions. Roger had plans. By the time anyone in our family understood what was actually happening, June had moved 4 states away from everyone who loved her, quietly, one relocation at a time, each one framed as an opportunity too good to pass up. It took June almost 5 years to find her way back to us after that marriage ended. She used to tell me, long before I had a daughter of my own, "Roz, the man who makes every decision for you, before you're even in the room, isn't loving you, he's managing you." I hadn't thought about that sentence in years. I would think about it constantly over the following months. Grant, for his part, had grown up outside Memphis, the son of a regional bank manager, and had built a genuinely impressive career in wealth management by 34, the kind of resume that made every relative at Thanksgiving nod approvingly. He was charming at dinners. He remembered to compliment the cooking. He also, I began to notice, on the 2 or 3 occasions I saw him with Claire, before the wedding planning began in earnest, had a habit of finishing her sentences for her, especially when she was talking about her job, as though counseling middle schoolers was a phase she'd eventually outgrow into something he considered more serious. None of that, on its own, worried me. Plenty of confident men have rough edges. Claire was not naive, and she loved him. I told myself that was enough. I should also tell you how Claire and Grant actually met, because it colors everything that came later. They met at a fundraiser for a literacy nonprofit Claire volunteered with on weekends, the kind of event where everyone wears their best blazer and nobody quite remembers what charity they're supporting by the second glass of wine. Grant had donated generously, made a short, polished speech about giving back to the community, and afterward spent nearly 20 minutes talking to Claire about her work with struggling students. She came home that night practically glowing, telling me over the phone that she'd finally met a man who seemed genuinely interested in what she did all day, rather than treating it as something to be politely tolerated between more important conversations. I remember feeling relieved when she told me that. I remember thinking, finally, someone who sees her. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that evening was Grant being genuinely charmed by her, and how much of it was Grant recognizing, correctly, that flattering a woman's purpose is the fastest way into her trust. I'm not sure even he could answer that honestly. People rarely can. When the two motives have been tangled together for so long, they've started to feel like the same thing. Claire's father, Harold, and I raised her to believe that being loved and being managed were 2 very different experiences, even if they can look nearly identical from the outside for a while. Harold spent 29 years running a small hardware store off Main Street before he sold it and mostly retired to tinker in our garage. And if there's one thing that man has never done in 34 years of marriage, it's make a decision that affects both of us without saying it out loud first. I didn't fully appreciate how rare that was until I started paying close attention to how Grant talked about decisions that weren't only his to make. I did not yet know that within a few weeks, I would be sitting in the front seat of my own car, listening to the man my daughter planned to marry describe her future to someone else, in a voice that never once included her. The private car service assigned me the same handful of regular corporate clients, and about 6 weeks into the job, one of them turned out to be Grant. I nearly drove off the road the first morning I recognized his voice from the back seat, mid-sentence on a phone call, saying my daughter's name, Claire. I kept my eyes forward, I kept my mouth shut. I had my cap low, my sunglasses on, and 18 months of a very different appearance between us. He never looked twice. For the first few weeks, I told myself this was almost funny, in a strange way. Twice a week, I drove Grant Calder from his condo near Cool Springs to his office downtown, and the entire time, 3 feet behind me, he had absolutely no idea he was sitting behind his future mother-in-law. I told Harold about it one night over dinner, and he nearly choked on his sweet tea. "You're telling me he has no idea?" "None." Harold laughed so hard, he had to set his fork down. For those first few weeks, it really was funny. Then, it stopped being funny. It started with small things. The way Grant spoke about Claire's job on a call with a colleague, referring to her counseling work as her little thing at the school. The way he interrupted a business partner mid-sentence to redirect a conversation back toward himself. The way, on more than one ride, he discussed a decision that affected 2 people using only the word "I." Not, "We've decided," not, "Claire and I talked about it," just, "I've decided. I'm doing this. I already told them yes." One Thursday, another executive shared the ride downtown and mentioned his daughter's upcoming piano recital. Grant let him finish exactly one sentence before steering the conversation back to his own college rowing career. A story I'd already heard twice that month, told with the exact same words both times, like a speech he'd polished rather than a memory he was recalling. The other man went quiet for the rest of the ride. Grant never noticed, or didn't care to. Then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything. Rain was falling steady against the windshield as we merged onto the interstate. Grant's phone rang. He answered on the first ring, the way he always did. "Yeah," he said. A pause, then a low laugh, the kind that made the hair on my arms stand up before I understood why. "No, seriously. Once we're married, she'll stop asking so many questions about all of it." I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. Maybe there was context I wasn't hearing. Maybe he meant something harmless. "I know her," Grant continued. "She trusts me. Right now she's still attached to Franklin. Her mom, her job, all of it. Once we're settled somewhere new, all that gets a lot simpler." Another pause, and then, quieter, almost satisfied. "The farther she is from her people, the easier this all becomes." Something cold moved through my chest, not anger yet, recognition. I heard my Aunt June's voice, as clearly as if she were sitting in the car with us. "The man who makes every decision for you, before you're even in the room, isn't loving you. He's managing you." Grant ended the call as we pulled up outside his building. "See you Thursday, Roz," he said. My name, my actual first name, printed on my driver badge, clipped to the dash, meaning absolutely nothing to him. "Have a good one." He stepped out into the rain and disappeared through the revolving doors, and I sat there in the idling car for almost a full minute, hands shaking slightly, trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood. I replayed the call in my head the entire drive back to the depot. I kept searching for an innocent version of it, the way you search a dark room for a light switch you know is there somewhere. Maybe he meant Claire would stop asking questions about wedding logistics, something small and forgettable. Maybe the farther she is from her people was about convenience, not control. I wanted, badly, to find that innocent version, because the alternative meant I'd spent 5 months smiling politely at a man who was quietly planning to take my daughter 1,500 miles from everyone who loved her and calling it romance. That evening, I sat across from Harold at our kitchen table and said almost nothing while he told me about his day, nodding at the right moments, not really hearing a word of it. He finally set his fork down. "Roz, where are you?" Not a question, really. A statement dressed as one, the way he does when he already knows something's wrong. I told him I needed to think a little longer before I said anything out loud, even to him, because once I said it out loud, it would be real, and I wasn't ready yet for it to be real. He hadn't said our plans. He hadn't said, Claire and I decided. Everything Grant described had been his decision, his timeline, his version of a future that supposedly belonged to two people, and for the first time, I let myself wonder whether the man my daughter was about to marry saw her as a partner at all, or as a project he intended to relocate, refine, and eventually finish. I didn't tell Claire that day. I told myself I needed to be sure. That mini cliffhanger sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of that week, and it would take a discovery I wasn't looking for to turn suspicion into something I could no longer ignore. For 3 days, I carried what I'd heard around like a stone in my coat pocket, taking it out to examine it every time I was alone, then putting it away again every time doubt crept back in. Harold, my husband of 34 years, knew something was wrong before I said a word. We were sitting on our back porch on a Friday evening, the cicadas loud in the trees behind our fence, when he finally asked, "You've been somewhere else all week," he said. "Maybe I misunderstood something," I told him. "You don't sound convinced." I wasn't. I told him everything. The call, the tone, the phrase that still sat wrong in my chest days later. Harold listened the way he always does, without interrupting, and when I finished, he said the thing I needed and didn't want to hear. "Pay attention, Roz. Watch. But don't accuse a man of anything until you actually know what he's done." That was fair advice, better than I probably deserved, because if I was honest with myself, a part of me had already decided I didn't like Grant Calder, and fear can make a mother dangerous just as easily as it can make a father dangerous. So I watched. The following week, on a Thursday ride, Grant took a call from someone named Preston about a job. "I already told them I'm interested," he said. A pause. "No, Claire doesn't know yet." My stomach tightened around the word yet. A few minutes later, Boise makes the most sense for us long term. Boise, Idaho, over 1,800 miles from Franklin, Tennessee. Claire had never once mentioned Boise to me, not in passing, not as a joke. That Sunday, she came for dinner, the way she often did, bringing a salad and updates on the wedding venue. While we cleared plates together, I asked, as casually as I could manage, "You two given any thought to where you'll live after the wedding?" She smiled without hesitation. "Here, Franklin's home. Grant loves it here too." That answer hit harder than I expected, because it meant one of two things. Either Grant hadn't told her about Boise at all, or he was planning to present it to her as something already decided. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, Harold rolled over. "You believe her?" "Completely." "Then maybe he hasn't told her yet." Neither of us said anything else, because we both understood exactly what that would mean if it were true. Over the following weeks, I started noticing a pattern I couldn't unsee. Grant discussed decisions in the future tense as though they were already finished. "We're moving, we're buying, we're doing this," but never once said, "We discussed," never once said, "We decided together." One ride, he spent nearly 20 minutes with a realtor discussing school districts and commute times in a suburb outside Boise. Meanwhile, every time Claire visited us, she talked about her future in Franklin like it was settled fact. Two completely different realities, and only one person living in both of them. Around this time, a new worry crept in that I want to be honest with you about, because it turned out to be a red herring, and I don't want to skip past how convincing it felt while it lasted. A name kept coming up on Grant's calls, a colleague named Ashley, texting him late in the evenings, showing up in half his conversations, said with a familiarity that made my stomach turn in a completely different direction. For almost 2 weeks, I was quietly, sickly certain that Claire's fiancé was having an affair on top of everything else. I'll tell you how that resolved shortly, because it taught me something important about how easily worry chases the wrong fire when you're already frightened of what you might find. The real fire showed itself on a rainy Wednesday, a few weeks before the engagement party. Grant climbed into the car, carrying his leather portfolio, distracted, checking his phone. Somewhere between his condo and downtown, the portfolio slipped open against the seat, and a folder slid halfway out onto the floor of the back seat. He didn't notice. When I pulled up to drop him off, he gathered his things in a hurry, late for a meeting, and left without checking the seat behind him. I found the folder 20 minutes later at a gas station, engine off, hands not quite steady. Inside were printed listings for 3-bedroom homes outside Boise, a term sheet from a law firm headed Prenuptial Agreement, Draft 3, with Claire's full legal name typed on the second page, beside language about separate property and future business interests that I didn't fully understand, but understood enough to feel sick reading, and a printed job offer letter dated 6 weeks earlier, already signed by Grant, for a position at a wealth management firm in Boise, Idaho. 6 weeks. He had known for 6 weeks, and Claire still thought they were staying in Franklin. I called my oldest friend, Denise Okafor, a retired Metro Nashville detective I'd known since our kids were in elementary school together, and told her everything over coffee 2 days later at a diner off Franklin Road we'd been meeting at for almost 15 years. Denise listened without interrupting, the way good detectives learn to, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer while I talked. When I finished, she leaned back. "You're looking for a smoking gun, Roz. You're not going to find one." She shook her head. "Guys like this usually aren't criminals. They're just people who've convinced themselves they're smarter than the person they claim to love. And smart enough men can talk themselves into believing that's the same thing as taking care of her. So, what do I do with what I already have?" "You don't need to prove he's a bad man," Denise said. "You need to make sure Claire has the full truth before she signs anything. The marriage license or that prenup, whichever comes first." She tapped the table once, like she was closing a case file in her head. "Facts. Not feelings, Roz. Feelings will get you into a shouting match you can't win. Facts she can't argue with." I asked her, half joking, half desperate, whether she thought I was overreacting, turning an ordinary ambitious man into a villain out of my own fear. Denise considered that seriously, the way she considered everything. "Maybe a little," she admitted, "but ambitious men who are also honest tell their partner about the job offer the same week they get it. They don't wait 6 weeks and let a prenup get drafted first." That settled something in me that coffee and worry alone hadn't been able to. Over the 2 weeks that followed, I kept driving Grant twice a week, and the picture kept sharpening. One morning he mentioned, almost as an aside to a colleague on speakerphone, that Claire worried too much about keeping her own income once they were married, and that once the wedding was behind them, 2 separate checking accounts wouldn't really make sense anymore. I gripped the wheel and said nothing. Claire had worked since she was 16. She'd paid off her own student loans 2 years early. She talked about her savings account the way some people talk about a garden they'd built by hand, plant by plant, and Grant discussed dismantling it the way you'd discuss trading in an old car. I want to be honest about the Ashley situation here, because for almost 2 weeks it consumed nearly as much of my worry as the relocation itself. Her name came up constantly, late texts, weekend calls, a level of familiarity in Grant's voice when he said it that made my stomach turn in a completely different direction. I lay awake more than one night, convinced I was about to hand my daughter proof of an affair on top of everything else, and I nearly said something to Claire before I had any real evidence at all, which would have been its own kind of damage if I'd been wrong. It was only on a ride 2 days before the party, when Grant mentioned to someone on the phone that Ashley's got the second half of the surprise handled, tell your sister I owe her one, that I understood Ashley was his business partner's sister, recruited to help coordinate the party logistics, nothing more. I share that with you, not because it matters to the ending, but because I think it's important to admit how easily worry chases the wrong fire when you're already frightened of what you might find. 2 days before the engagement party, Grant made one more call in the car, cheerful, almost giddy, discussing final arrangements for the venue, Harrow Creek Country Club. Nearly 100 guests, family flown in from 3 states. Then he said the sentence that told me everything about how this evening was meant to go. It's going to be a surprise. The whole announcement, Boise, all of it, right there in front of everyone. She'll love it once she sees the plan. Not once did he say he planned to ask her first. I sat in that gas station parking lot the night before the party, with a legal pad full of notes, the folder in my glove compartment, and one question left to answer: whether I was willing to risk everything with my daughter to make sure she got to make her own decision in her own life before 300 people made it for her. The engagement party was held on a warm evening in early June, string lights strung across the veranda at Harrow Creek Country Club, nearly 100 guests seated at round tables, draped in white linen, a small jazz trio playing near the bar. Claire looked radiant in pale green, laughing with cousins she hadn't seen in months, completely unaware of what was folded inside my handbag under the table. Grant's parents had flown in from Memphis. His firm's managing partner had come, along with a dozen colleagues I recognized from Grant's phone calls without ever having met. Harold squeezed my hand once beneath the tablecloth. He knew what I was carrying, and he knew I hadn't decided yet whether I'd use it. I remember thinking, watching Claire laugh across the room, that I had perhaps 30 minutes left to decide what kind of mother I was going to be for the rest of her life. Around 8 o'clock, Grant stepped up to a small stage near the head table, champagne glass in hand, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone important is about to speak. He thanked both families. He thanked Claire for making him, in his words, a better version of himself. A few guests dabbed their eyes. Then his smile widened into the shape of a man about to deliver the moment he'd been rehearsing for weeks. I believe in bold decisions, he said. So tonight, I wanted to give all of you, and especially you, Claire, something unforgettable. He turned toward her. We are so excited to begin our next chapter in Boise, Idaho. Applause started, scattered, uncertain, then died, almost as quickly as it began, because Claire wasn't clapping. She was staring at him, her smile frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. What are you talking about? Her voice, though quiet, carried through the microphone Grant was still holding near her. The move, Grant said, laughing nervously. The opportunity in Boise. What opportunity? Claire's 4 words landed on that veranda like a dropped glass. Absolute silence followed. That was my moment. I stood, slowly, no dramatics, just a 58-year-old woman rising from a linen-draped table with a folder in her hand. Grant's eyes swept the room, confused by the sudden shift in energy, and landed on me. I watched recognition arrive in stages. The cap was gone now, the sunglasses were gone, but something in my face still tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place, until it clicked all at once. Roz, he said, the color draining slightly from his face. You drive. I'm Claire's mother, I said. You've been sitting in my back seat twice a week for 4 months, talking about her like she was a line item in a plan you'd already finalized. A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the room. Claire turned to look at me, her expression shifting from shock at Grant's announcement to something closer to vertigo at mine. "Mom, what is happening?" I looked at her, not at him. "Always her, Claire. Before anyone makes another announcement tonight, I think you deserve to know a few things Grant already decided without telling you." I set the folder on the head table in front of her. "When did he tell you he'd already accepted a job in Boise?" Silence. "When did he tell you he'd looked at 3 homes there?" Grant opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "When did he tell you there's a prenup already drafted with your name on it?" Grant's father half rose from his seat near the front, then thought better of it and sat back down. Grant's managing partner, seated 2 tables over, suddenly found something fascinating in his wine glass. Nobody in that room moved to fill the silence, because everyone, on some level, understood that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would be the thing they all talked about for years afterward. The room had gone completely, uncomfortably still. Claire opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady and turned through the pages, one after another. The listings, the signed offer letter dated 6 weeks earlier, the draft agreement with her full legal name typed beside terms she'd never seen. I watched her face change with every page, confusion hardening slowly into something colder and clearer. 6 weeks, she said quietly, not looking up. "You've known for 6 weeks." "I was going to tell you," Grant said. "Tonight was supposed to be a surprise," Claire finished for him. "You keep calling it a surprise. A vacation is a surprise, Grant. My entire life isn't." "I thought you'd be excited once you saw the plan," Grant said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, the polish finally slipping. "I thought if I laid it all out, the house, the job, everything already handled, you'd see how much thought I put into it." "You put thought into deciding," Claire said, "not into asking. There's a difference, and I don't think you've ever once seen it." She looked down at the folder again, at the prenup with her own name typed beside terms she'd never read, and something in her posture straightened, the way I imagine a person stands right before they stop apologizing for taking up space. "I need you to leave," she said. Not dramatically, just, "Please leave, Grant." Grant tried, for several long minutes, to explain himself in front of 100 silent guests, and every explanation made things worse, because every version of the story ended the same way. He hadn't asked, he had decided, and intended to inform her, gently, gradually, on his own schedule, in his own words, at the moment of his choosing. Claire slid the ring from her finger and set it in his palm without raising her voice. "I loved you," she said. "I know," Grant answered, and for the first time all evening, he sounded like he meant it. "I believe that," Claire said, "but you never once asked me what I wanted. Not about the job, not about the house, not even about tonight." She looked around at the guests, then back at him. "You didn't propose a future to me, Grant. You issued one." He left quietly 10 minutes later. No scene, no shouting, just a man walking out into a parking lot, carrying the weight of every decision he'd made alone. The weeks that followed were not easy. Claire was hurt, embarrassed in front of family, and some of that landed on me, fairly, for the way I'd handled discovering it. She barely returned my calls for almost 10 days, and those were some of the longest 10 days I've lived through, longer even than the months of not knowing what I was watching Grant plan. Harold kept telling me to give her room, that she needed to be angry at both of us for a while, before she could be grateful to either of us, and he was right, the way he usually is about things I don't want to hear. 2 days after the party, Denise called me with something I hadn't expected. She'd made a few calls of her own, out of habit more than anything, the kind of digging retired detectives apparently can't fully stop doing even after they've turned in the badge, and learned that Grant's previous engagement, 3 years earlier, to a woman named Paige in Memphis, had ended for almost identical reasons. A sudden relocation announced to family before it was ever discussed with Paige herself. A prenup she hadn't been shown until weeks before the wedding. A public unraveling at a much smaller gathering that most people who knew Grant now had quietly agreed never to mention again. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, refined once already and repeated on a second woman who never saw it coming until it was standing on a stage in front of 100 people. When I finally told Claire that part, weeks later, she went very quiet for a long moment and then said the thing that has stayed with me since. So I wasn't even the first one he did this to. I was just the second draft. I finally told Claire the story of my Aunt June that same week. The marriage that slowly moved her 4 states from anyone who loved her. The years it took her to find her way home. The sentence June had said to me decades earlier that I'd carried in my chest through every ride in that car. The man who makes every decision for you before you're even in the room isn't loving you, he's managing you. Claire cried when I told her, not for Grant, for June, and a little, I think, for the version of herself she'd almost become. June herself, now 81, and living 20 minutes from us in an assisted living community she chose entirely on her own terms, asked to meet Claire for lunch a few weeks after the party. I wasn't there for that conversation, and I've never asked either of them exactly what was said, but Claire came home from it quieter than usual, and later told me only that June had said something to her that she planned to carry with her for the rest of her life, the same way I'd carried it for 30 years before I finally understood what it meant. 6 months later, Claire enrolled in an advanced counseling certification she'd been putting off for years, bought a small house of her own outside Franklin, and began, slowly, to sound like herself again. One Sunday afternoon, drying dishes together in my kitchen, she bumped my shoulder gently. "You were terrifying that night, you know," she said. "Only terrifying? Extremely terrifying," she smiled. "Thank you, Mom. That was enough, more than enough." It was, I think, the first time since the engagement party that either of us laughed about any part of it, and it felt like the beginning of something steadier between us than we'd had before all of this started. I've thought a great deal, since that night, about what it actually means to protect your child. For most of my life, I believed it meant solving problems before they ever reached her. It doesn't. Sometimes, it means putting the truth on the table in front of her and trusting her enough to decide what happens next, even if that truth costs you something first. I still wonder, some nights, how long I would have stayed quiet if I hadn't found that folder by accident. I wonder how many women are sitting at their own engagement parties right now, smiling at an announcement they were never actually asked about. I don't have a clean answer for that. Maybe you do. If you were in my seat that night, would you have said something at the party, in front of everyone, the way I did? Or would you have waited, pulled your daughter aside quietly afterward, and risked her marrying him anyway, before the truth ever surfaced? I'd genuinely love to know what you would have done, and where you think the line is between protecting someone and interfering in their life. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and some of your stories from past videos have honestly stayed with me longer than I expected. I also want to ask you something else, something that's stuck with me since that night at Harrow Creek. My Aunt June spent nearly 5 years finding her way back to a family that loved her, after a man convinced her, one reasonable-sounding decision at a time, that distance from us was simply what a good future looked like. If someone you loved were slowly being moved away from everyone who knew them best, one small justified step at a time, would you notice before it was finished, or only after, the way most of my family noticed with June? I think about that question more than I expected to when I started making this video, and I don't have a tidy answer for it. Maybe telling me your own version of that story in the comments is the closest any of us gets to one. If this story pulled at something in you, stick around, because next week, I'm sharing the story of a woman who found her late mother's handwriting inside a stranger's house 40 years after she disappeared, and what that discovery finally explained about a family secret nobody had ever been brave enough to ask about out loud. It's one of the most personal stories I've told on this channel, and I think it's going to stay with you the way it stayed with me. Before you go, if you enjoyed spending this hour with Claire, Grant, and me, I'd be so grateful if you hit that subscribe button and turned on notifications, so you're always the first to know when a new story goes up. Thank you for being here and for listening all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.